بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in the second part of our lesson on menstruation, we're looking at the rulings related to menstruation, right? And these are many and consequential. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, tells us, وَيَمْنَعُ صَلَاةً وَصَوْمًا, right? And hayd, menstruation, prevents prayer and fasting, right? Some copies also include here وَوَطْأً, right? Some copies include here وَوَطْأً. Do you have that? You look shocked. Yeah, so some copies have this, others don't, right? So it says menstruation prevents prayer and fasting, and some here mentions an intercourse. Most don't appear to have it. It's not there in the very late sharh, that's Kashf al-Haqa'iq, which is not a proof, but it's a late sharh, and he very clearly looked at most of the other shuruh before, right? So that's not a proof, but it doesn't change the rulings per se, but just to note it, okay? So what is the implication, right? Right? It prevents prayer and fasting. He tells us, وَتَقْضِيهِ دُونَهَا, right? And she makes it up, not it, right? تَقْضِيهِ, and this is from the Daqa'iq. He relies on your understanding of Arabic. تَقْضِيهِ, what is male? Sawm, right? Right? But it's good, even in the copy that you use, you annotate the copy, right? تقضيه أي الصوم, right? أي الصوم. دونها, she makes it up, meaning the fasting, not the prayer. أي لا تقضي الصلاة, right? The wisdom of it is al-haraj, because of the hardship. But that lam is lil-hikmah. It's not للتعليل الشرعي. The Shari'i basis is the hadiths about it, right? The texts, the explicit hadiths, and some argue even from the Quran, that you have to, the Sayyidah Aisha says, we used to be commanded to make up our fasts, but not our prayers. And you can find the textual evidences in brief in Kashf al-Haqa'iq, right? So she makes it up, but not it, right? Then he says, and here there's a few things, right? So this haraj aspect, right? Haraj is one of the avoidance of haraj is one of the underlying principles of the Sharia. Right? وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ, and he has not placed for you in religion any haraj. And the min here, right, because conveys emphasis. Why? That he has not, because if you say مَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ دِينِ حَرَجًا, this would be broad, general. But min haraj is like, has not placed for you in religion hardship, so generally. But min haraj meaning any hardship whatsoever, right? And that's why every letter of the Quran is in its place. So مَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. And that's why they have a general قاعدة فقهية that al-haraj madfu', hardship is warded off. Hardship conceptually is of two types. Al-harajul yasir, slight hardship, والحرج اليسير من مقتضيات التكليف. Slight hardship is entailed by moral responsibility. Getting up for Fajr is a hardship, as opposed to not getting up. Yeah, that's taklif is imposition of a burden. But anything that there is responsibility for is not excessive hardship, and it's within human capacity, right? As we know from the closing verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, right? And that's important to always reiterate, right? So Ibn Abdin mentions here, لأن في قضاء الصلاة حرجا بتكررها في كل يوم, because making up prayers could entail hardship insofar as it's repeated every day. And there's ijma' on this. There's no valid position that prayer is to be made up, right? Okay. And there is a point here that's mentioned at this point in Hashiyat Ibn Abidin, and it's mentioned throughout the works of fiqh, or not throughout, but in many of the works of fiqh, that وَيُسْتَحَبُّ لَهَا أَن تَتَوَضَّأَ لِوَقْتِ كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ وَتَقْعُدْ عَلَى مُصَلَّاهَا تُسَبِّحْ وَتُهَلِّلْ وَتُكَبِّرْ بِقَدْرِ أَدَائِهَا. It is recommended for a woman to make wudu. The woman menstruating, it's recommended for her to make wudu for each prayer. Each includes Fajr, and some mention, and even the recommended times, right? To sit for each prayer, particularly the obligatory ones. But if someone wants to do the nawafil, even the nafil prayer times, like night worship, etc., because those are times both for worship and for remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And that has a preserving benefit and a cultivating benefit. The preserving benefit is to preserve the habit of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So she makes wudu, and in our madhab, that wudu, it's not for tahara, it's it's not for the legal purification, right? And whether to make tasbih or to make dhikr, right? They mentioned tasbih, tahleed, so subhanallah, la ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, right? Or to engage in beneficial knowledge or in dua or anything. And they said to the extent of her normal routine of fard prayer, right? It's recommended, right? There's also another point that the more correct opinion in our madhab, Ibn Abdin points out here, is that making up fasts is obligatory non-immediately, ala tarahi. That's the more correct opinion in the madhab. And that's the position of most of the mashayikh. So that is about prayer and fasting. And then he says, وَدُخُولَ الْمَسْجِدِ أي وَيَمْنَعُ دُخُولَ الْمَسْجِدِ أي وَيَمْنَعُ الْحَيْضُ دُخُولَ الْمَسْجِدِ. And the hayd also prevents entering the mosque. Now here, it prevents the permissibility of entering the mosque, not the validity, right? Because some things, so there's different types of duty, right? So prayer, it lifts validity, it lifts obligation, validity, and permissibility, right? Three things are lifted, right? Prayer, it's not obligatory, it's not valid, and it's not permitted. Correct? The fasting is what? is not valid and it's not permitted, but still remains obligatory insofar as that she has to make it up, right? So they're distinct in that sense. Entering the mosque, entering is an outward action. It is not permitted to enter the mosque ويمنع دخول المسجد. Now, he points out that Imam al-Nasafi pointed out that his itlaqat, when he mentions something unconditioned, is indicative of a position that he's taken. Right? Many of the mutun mentions walau lil murur, even just to pass through. Right? But he doesn't mention it. Why? Because entering the mosque, entering the mosque is not permitted for the woman in hayd because of the hadith related to it, right? Right? Because of the hadith related to it. Right? And because the Prophet ﷺ said, فَإِنِّي لَا أُحِلُّ الْمَسْجِدَ لِحَائِض وَلَا جُنُبٍ. Right? I do not permit the masjid, meaning the entering of the masjid, for the ha'id or the junub. Right? And this is unconditional. And the indications of the unconditional are considered decisive in our madhab. Right? And the masjid is that which has been designated as masjid, right? So in an Islamic center, only the area that is designated as masjid is not allowed for women during their period. Other areas that are not designated masjid are permitted to enter, right? So for example, if there's a gymnasium, right? Logically, because you in one building you can exclude certain areas, right? For example, decisively we know that the toilet could not be designated masjid. Because if it were designated masjid, right? And a simple question to ask that people running the masjid is, what is designated masjid? I said the whole place is masjid. Then you know that they have no clue what they're talking about, because the toilets, if they're designated as masjid, they have to be shut down. Because you cannot urinate or defecate in the masjid. So necessarily that is excused. And other things can be excused, right? Because so that's a separate discussion. But entering the masjid, so the smart way of establishing masjid, sort of the men's area would be the legal masjid. So it's all broadly a masjid in the general sense. But what's the legally the masjid is that area, right? That way, you know, because if there, Sunday school classes, there's other things happening, etc. So the other areas, there would be leeway. In many communities, they only have the community is only able to establish one location. So the whole thing is masjid, then how are you going to do Sunday classes for teenage girls, for women, etc.? It'd be quite complicated. So anyways, and that's just something to note. Okay. Right? So even for passing through in our madhab, it's not permitted. You have to go around. Unless it is unavoidable. There are some places where the house, you have to cross through the courtyard of the masjid, and it is designated masjid. Generally, it's best not to just walk through the masjid, right? But those have to do with the ahkam al-masjid. We'll take them separately. And what tawaf, and it also prevents tawaf, right? It prevents the permissibility of the tawaf. Tawaf while ritually impure, what is its ruling? Sorry, don't mumble, please. Yeah, it's sahih ma tarkil wajib. It's valid, but prohibitively disliked, because you've left the wajib. Tahara for tawaf is wajib. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran, وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ. Let them perform tawaf, and tatawwafa is from the emphatic form. So we know, so the expression tawaf is a khas expression. It's known in meaning in the Arabic language, right? Those addressed knew clearly what tawaf means. To circumambulate in a particular manner, right, around the Kaaba. It doesn't mention the number, but that's separate. So the act itself is khas, is a khas expression, it's a specific expression. The number is a separate consideration. The number is not mentioned or indicated, but there's an indication in it of it being plural. وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا. So that the Sunnah explains it. But there's no specification needed. So there was a specification needed for number. So the bayan, it accepts bayan in terms of number. But the mode of tawaf, i.e. that it be in tahara, was not required, because it's clear. So it says, make any tawaf. That's the implication. Make any multiple circumambulations around the Kaaba. How many? That's a question that does arise. So that is, it accepts bayan, clarification for that. It does not require clarification with respect to any tawaf. Because saying that you have to have wudu for it as a condition, meaning an obligation, that would be as if you are limiting the indication of a decisive expression. What is the decisive expression? The implication is any thing named tawaf would do. But then the Prophet ﷺ said that no one in a state of ritual impurity may perform tawaf. That kind of text establish a wajib, not a fard, because it's a non-decisive text. And that goes back to the issue of a decisive text is decisive, and it cannot be conditioned by a non-decisive text. Number one, the khas and the am generally, both the general and specific expressions, normally do not accept conditioning, right? Rather, the non-decisive text or the conditioning text is understood at its level, and its level of evidentiary strength is a wajib. It's a non-decisive text. Okay. That's just right. وَقُرْبَانَ مَا تَحْتَ الْإِزَارِ, and approaching. So literally it says approaching anything under the mid area clothing, right? Like the izar, under, meaning direct contact between navel and knee, right? So he uses this expression because it's closest to both the Quran in its wording and to the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوهُنَّ حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَ, right? And do not approach them. And because the Prophet ﷺ said, لَكَ مَا فَوْقَ الْإِزَارِ, you're allowed what is beyond or what is above the izar. So from the Quranic expression, so often the ulama, you see this caution that they stick to that expression, even though the legal expression would be different. There's a beautiful discussion from Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri in Fayd al-Bari, related from him in Fayd al-Bari, Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari. And it's mentioned by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda in a gem of a book called Al-Rasul al-Muallim, the Prophet ﷺ as a teacher. And he discusses the wisdom that the Quranic texts are, and this is from the marvel of the Quran, right? The Quranic expressions are so precise that we apply the levels of indication that the ulama discuss, right? In usul al-fiqh, right? There's no higher legal text than the Quran, right? But yet, the Quran is not a legal text. So there's no higher legal text than the Quran. And there's no legal expression that can be as precise as the Quranic expression. No human being can compare in expression. And if you read about principles of legal interpretation and the interpretation of the US Constitution or reading law, etc., a lot of things are written about it, and theories of legal interpretation. Nothing approaches that. But at the same time, this from the marvel of the Quran. Is the Quran a book of law? No, it's a book of guidance. So the expressions of the law, while being as precise as they are, and they're marvels of precision and layers of indication, but yet they're not only law, they're there for guidance. Right? And part of guidance, and guidance has many aims. It defines the law, but it also inspires, and is rhetorical, and it encourages and warns. And who is addressed by the guidance? Everybody. You can if a child understood the Quran, they can read it, they can pass by all the texts about intercourse. You don't say, oh, beta, don't read verses this and this and this. I mean, some of the translations you have to be careful. Like the Noble Quran should be banned from every masjid on earth. Right? Just read its translation of Lam Yatmithunna. Right? That wouldn't pass censor boards in most of the Muslim world. Right? And elsewhere. Right? So anyways, so وَقُرْبَانْ مَا تَحْتَ الْإِزَارِ, they use this expression because of the verse لَا تَقْرَبُوهُنَّ حَتَّى يَطْهُرْنَ, and because of the hadith of the Prophet لَكَ مَا فَوْقَ الْإِزَارِ, and other hadiths like it. But what is the fiqh of it? Right? The fiqh of it, right? ما بين سرة وركبة, right? ولو بلا شهوة. Right? So what is not permitted is that which is between navel and knee without a barrier. So there's one thing that is impermissible, which is that which is between the navel and the knee without a barrier. Everything else is permitted, which is between navel and knee with a barrier, and beyond navel and knee with or without a barrier. Right? So at a basic level, there are four possibilities. There's between navel and knee, and there's beyond navel and knee. Both are with barrier or without barrier. So there's four possibilities. All that is not permitted is one of the four, which is between navel and knee without a barrier. I mean, without a barrier, meaning skin to skin contact between navel and knee. Right? between the woman's navel and knee. Anything else is permitted. Between navel and knee with a barrier is permitted. Beyond navel and knee, with or without barrier, is permitted. Desire doesn't factor into it. Any of this is done with desire, without desire. Someone's, unless of course it's a medical emergency. Someone, the husband wants to massage his wife's thighs because she over-exercised and she has thigh, said he had have to do it through a barrier. There's no question of desire there. It's not permitted. The exception to the desire is extrinsic, which is unless the type of the contact, there is reasonable fear that it could lead to what is impermissible of the skin-to-skin contact, or beyond that, which is the al-ifda ila al-jima', leading to intercourse. So that is, and this is, and the ulama are, right? So, are sexual relations are allowed during menstruation? Yes, except for intercourse itself and skin-to-skin contact between navel and knee. Whether that is with everything else is permitted. And the ulama are very explicit about that. They say, وَلَوْ تَلَطَّخَ دَمًا, even if one gets blood all over oneself. Right? And you can see. And it is a bid'ah to separate from women in sharing, for husband and wife, not to share the same bedding during menstruation. To sleep separately from them is a bid'ah. It's from what other past religious traditions did, and that the Prophet castigated that. There are some cultural traditions, even, for example, in the subcontinent, etc., taken from some of the local religious traditions, but has nothing to do with Islam. With respect to sleeping in the same bedding, that's one is custom. You don't have to say, okay, you're menstruating, now I'll come and sleep with you. Like if they have whatever sleeping arrangements they have, but changing them because she's in menstruation is not permitted. Avoiding their food or any other contact with them is not, is also a bid'ah, and there's many hadiths related to that. Okay. Then he says, وقراءة القرآن, right? And reciting the Quran, right? ويمنع الحيض قراءة القرآن. Hayd prevents the recitation of the Quran, right? Meaning in terms of its permissibility. And he says, وَمَسَّهُ إِلَّبِغِلَافٍ, and touching it except through a cover. So let's take these steps. It prevents reciting of the Quran in the dur. It says بِقَصْدِهِ, with the intention of Quran, right? So anything called Quran you cannot recite, right? So they said that anything that's called Quran مَا يَتَنَاوَلُهُ اسم القرآن. Then the ulama differed, is it minimally one verse, or even it would apply to less than one verse? And the khilaf is really matter of semantics, but so, because the least that's considered Quran is the extent of 2 verses. There's a lot of discussion about that, right? The basis is what would be called Quran. right? فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. Recite what is facilitated of the Qur'an. Right? So anything that would be called Qur'an, even if it's less than one verse, right? Then, so something in the Qur'an that is recited with the intention of dua, dhikr, or thana, or hifth, dua, dhikr, thana, hifth, supplication, remembrance, praise, or protection, right, is permitted. Ibn Abdin says, فَلَوْ قَرَأَ الْفَاتِحَةَ على وجه الدعاء أو شيئا من الآيات التي فيها بعض الدعاء ولم يرد القراءة لا بأس به. Right? So if the woman during her period recites the Fatiha, for example, as dua, right? Or anything of the verses that have the meaning of dua, not intending recitation by that, there's nothing wrong with it. Right? And likewise, the ulama mentioned dua, dhikr, thana, and hifth. Right? Because hifth, like, if you recite them, one, for example, the three quls. The first part is, Surah al-Ikhlas is dhikr. Right? Is dhikr. The Falaq and Nas are dua. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. This is dua. Right? Is dua and hifth. Right? So before going to sleep, can a Muslim woman recite the three quls? Yes. Can she recite Ayat al-Kursi? Yes, because it has the meaning of dhikr and it has the meaning of hifth. Right? And so on. Now some of the ulama, some quote al-Hunduwani saying, I don't give fatwa on this even if it's Zahir al-Riwayah. That's his choice. But because the asl of the madhab is the madhab, right? Mawlana Ashraf Ali Tanvi in Imdad al-Fatawa discusses this, that when would it be better to avoid? And there's a very good discussion on this there. When would it be better to avoid? Only if someone has doubt that, let me recite the Quran by intending dua. Then, what's your intention? Quran, fake. No, but, like say someone has an exam coming up. Someone's feeling stressed. Recite the Fatiha. And at that time, why are you reciting the Fatiha? Dua. Right? Dua. Because when we say ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the path that is straight, the straight path is the path to Allah's pleasure and the path that will make me attain the good of this life and the good of the next. Right? And so that's why it's called Surah al-Dua. Right? And it's the first part is dhikr, second part is dua. That's mansus fil madhab. Right? And qira'ah, of course, is an action of the tongue. Right? Listening or quote unquote reading without touching, and recitation is not. So can a woman read the Quran? Yes, she can recite it. And that difference should be clear. Also, she can listen to the Quran. Right? Because the prohibition of this, the ulama tell us, is غير معقول المعنى. It's not, this is a devotional ruling. So we don't make qiyas on it. Right? It is not a معقول المعنى. It is not one whose legal reason is discernible, such that we can make qiyas on it, etc., etc. وقراءة القرآن. But things that don't have the meaning of dua or dhikr or thana directly, you can't recite them during hayd, like Surah Abi Lahab, Although there's argument about that. Can you intend? And and there's argument. Some of the arguments say you could intend because by dilalatin nas, but I say you want to make dua against your enemies, do it with other than Surah Abi Lahab then, right? Right? Say, well, I have Abi Lahabs in my life, so I want to make dua against them. No, don't make dua against a particular person anyway, or against the enemies of Islam. Anyways. Illabihilaf, except through a cover. And so you cannot touch it except through a cover. Right? He leaves this general, but there is, because there's a khilaf about the ghilaf, about the cover. Because basically there are two types of covers, muttasil and munfasil. A connected cover and a non-connected cover. So the ghilaf, so this encompasses two opinions within the madhab. And they're both musahhah, and they're both validated. However, the relied upon position, right, which is we want to focus on, but note that there's two validated opinions on this. But the relied upon position, you can only touch the Quran through a non-connected cover. إِلَّا بِغِلَافٍ munfasil, as the Durr mentions. And this is the fatwa position, as both Abu Saud and Ibn Abidin mention. You cannot touch the Quran through a connected cover. Right? Because the cover is considered from musamma al-mushaf or musamma al-Quran littisali bihi, because it's connected with it. It doesn't have to be permanently connected. Some people say, there's mushafs where there's a leather cover. Technically, you could take it off, so it sort of wears the leather cover, so it's connected. It doesn't have to be permanently connected, right? So some covers, like you can slip in the paper cover off, into the cover. That you can't touch without wudu, according to sound opinion, because right at that point it is connected, right? But what would be excluded, like a box, like some mushafs come with a box cover, you can take the mushaf out, so that you could legally touch without wudu, but it would be recommended to avoid doing so. Illa bi ghilaf. Right? So she cannot touch the Quran itself, and this includes she cannot touch the page of the Quran. And if the Quran is written elsewhere, she cannot touch the text itself. Right? The text itself. And then At-Tanweer adds a number of important things here. There's nothing wrong for the woman in hayd or the junub to recite any dua, or to touch collections of dua, or to carry collections of dua. And there's nothing wrong with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or tasbih. Rather, their recommendation remains as it was before. But for the junub, it is superior for them to take the means to make wudu, or to take their ghusl. So someone, let's say, they prayed Fajr, then they required ghusl. But then they have their morning awrad. You could do your morning awrad without ghusl. There's no karaha in it. And during those awrad, like for example, someone recites any of the routines, whether, like for example, whether it be the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad, or the Hizb al-A'zam of Mullah Ali al-Qari, or like the Wadifa Shadiliya or whatever, and they have Quranic verses in them that are done as dhikr or dua, one could recite those, even for the, whether for the ha'id or the junub, the one in, but it would be superior to make ghusl. But if it means you're not going to do it, because I'm going to make ghusl when I wake up, I'm really tired, then it's better to do it than not to do it. Because one is, la ba's. It'd be better to have ghusl. You're going to break your routine, do it anyways. That's all discussed by just as the person in right, so that's except through a cover, right? Then he says, now there's a couple of other things regarding touching the Quran. There are two opinions. Can you touch the Quran can you hold the Quran with your sleeve or anything that you're wearing? There are two opinions on that. The more cautious opinion is yukrah tahriman. It is prohibitively disliked to touch the Quran with your sleeve or anything that you are deemed to be wearing. And Ibn Abdin relates from the Fatawa Qadi Khan that Qadi Khan argued that this is Zahir al-Riwayah. Right? So anything that you are considered wearing, you can't, and this is makruh tahriman, right? As mentioned by Ibn Abdin, quoting al-Tahtawi. And he appears to concur with it. But let's say if the Quran Mus'haf falls on the ground, you take and you don't have wudu, if you can, you can pick it up with a napkin, for example, because you're not wearing the napkin, right? If somehow you covered you made an izar out of toilet roll, then rip some part of the toilet roll, or an izar out of tissue paper, then rip some tissue paper without uncovering your awrah, pick it up. The ulama mentioned one exception, which is if the mushaf falls on the ground, you don't have wudu, even if you're junub, then if you have, it's because the Quran being on the ground is ihana. So let's say someone walked out of the shower naked, let's say they shouldn't, but let's say they walked out of the shower naked. They shouldn't. Once you keep one's core awrah covered, they walked out of the shower naked, and the baby threw the mushaf on the ground. You pick it up, and you put it in a respected place with the minimum action necessary. Why? Because okay, let me get dressed, and then and when you came out of the shower, the step caused you to lose your wudu. Right? So you came out of the shower, and it was an invalid shower. You came out of the shower, or you didn't make a shower, you just came out of the washroom, naked, mushaf's on the ground. You pick it up, you put it on the desk. If you can do it with a sleeve, etc., it's worse than doing it directly with one's skin, but leaving the mushaf on the ground, or if a kid's going to rip the mushaf and you don't have wudu, you take it from the kid, you put it in a high place, the immediate place, right? Because ta'zeem al-Quran is akad, is more emphatic. And that's obvious, but it needs mention. It is a bid'ah shani'ah. It's a vile bid'ah of people leave the mushaf on the ground. Right? The exception could be if it is from the urf of religious, upright, God-fearing people of knowledge in some place, because some nomadic peoples or some desert dwellers, they don't have bookshelves. So they keep their religious books on the ground. In general, books that are Books, if they're piled up on the ground, it's not makruh. And many of the ulama would have books all over the place. But putting one book on the ground, and some said even two, just, is inappropriate. It's makruh. Because ta'zeem al-kutub is wajib. In our madhab, in the Shafi'i school, leaning your arm, the stronger opinion in the Shafi'i school is leaning your hand against the book. Even briefly, like you're sitting in the car, you put your hand on the books, the stronger opinion is that it's haram. Because it's tark ta'zeem al-ilm. And we're not talking about the mushaf. In our madhab, it's makruh to lean against religious books without need. Like someone's going to fall over or whatever. Some of the ulama say, just fall over. You probably won't break anything. But likewise, putting anything worldly on top of a book of knowledge is makruh. In some opinions, it's makruh tahriman. But at the very least, it's makruh. Right? So one should never promote anything, but people like opening the mushaf and then putting a sibha on top of it, like those images. Never share such an image. That's makruh, and the nusх ad-dini would indicate politely, with wisdom, positively, mentioning, especially if you know someone, that should not be done. It's makruh. The Quran, this is kitabullah. It's wajib al-ta'zeem. A sibha, though it's extrinsically praiseworthy. Extrinsic, insofar it's an instrument of dhikr. So they cannot compare. Likewise, putting glasses on it, etc. Never do that. Putting a pen on a religious book should not be done. And this all mansus alayhi fil madhab. Okay. And then he lists what is prevented in a state of ritual impurity. So he says, وَمَنَعَ الْحَدَثُ الْمَسِّ. Right? And ritual impurity prevents touching, meaning, i.e., touching the Quran. Now, the L here is referential. So when you translate things like this, you can put prevents touching the Quran, because the L is referential. It doesn't prevent touching, it prevents touching the Quran. So you don't have to, right? What's the implication of this? أي لا يمنع قراءته. Ritual impurity prevents touching the Quran, i.e., it does not prevent the permissibility of reciting the Quran. So minor ritual impurity, that's what al-hadath is, al-asghar, right? So minor ritual impurity prevents touching the Quran, but recitation remains permitted without dislike. However, it is recommended to be in wudu. But there's no dislike in reciting the Quran without wudu, but it's recommended to be in wudu. Right? And the ulama mention explicitly, and it's mentioned by Abu Sa'ud, يجوز له أن يقرأ من المصحف إذا قلب الأوراق بنحو قلم. It is permitted to recite the Quran from a mushaf without wudu, without touching the mushaf directly, such as by using a pen and the like. Right? That's for the person in hadath asghar, right? Because hadath prevents touching the Quran, but it'd be recommended go make wudu, right? But it's not makruh, right? وَمَنَعَهُمَا الْجَنَابَ وَالنِّفَاسِ. And major ritual impurity and postnatal bleeding prevent both reciting and touching the Quran. right? Because of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر, right? 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 And many other texts. And the same thing applies here, that one can recite the verses that have dua or dhikr with their intention. In the previous section, Ibn Abdin focused on dua. But here, with the janaba and nifas, he also mentions dua or dhikr with its intention. Right? And there's some useful, there's a tatimma, a completing discussion in Abi Saud that it is permitted to teach a non-Muslim the Quran if there's any hope that they'd be guided. But the Quran is meant to be preserved from ill treatment, right? So the basis is that a non-Muslim should not be given the Quran without a state of tahara. And if one is selling mushafs, right, like a bookstore, etc., they should be, one should take the means, that someone gets it, one gives basic guidelines. So then the onus is on them. If you've given the guidelines, then the onus is on them. 2 guidelines. One is, this is our sacred book, right? It is meant to be touched in a state of ritual purity. This is how you can do it, number 1. Number 2 is, if you no longer, if at any point you need to dispose of it, this is how you can dispose of it. And in many Muslim countries, and I've seen this in the Middle East, and I've seen in Syria, I've seen in Jordan, I've seen in Turkey, I'm sure it's elsewhere in the Middle East, also seen in Pakistan. There are services, you can drop off old mushafs, etc., and they dispose of them according to the principles of the Sharia. Because the Quran is worthy of our respect, but it's not just wishful thinking, so that there are 2 components. And some of the masahif, even for Muslims, because many people are not aware. Yeah? So if one ships it, one could wrap it in a manner that, you put these guidelines, you put it positively, and one should have ta'zeem of shara, of the shara of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? One of my teachers mentioned, almost 20 years ago now, he was invited to give a lecture about tasawwuf at Harvard. On the way to the lecture hall, he thought that I'm going to talk about the highest science of Islam, the very heart of the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah, right? The highest expression of ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what tasawwuf is, right? There's the essence of the teachings of the Quran, but everything else is required for it, right? Because you can't have the essence without. And then about half, because it's going to be mainly non-Muslims, about half the audience will be in open disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it will be uncovered, etc. So he got there early, so he talked to the organizers. Said one day in their musalla they have these stacks of hijabs. So very nicely requested that, out of respect, said, this is, given that spirituality is the highest expression of devotion to God, etc., etc. So you put it with wisdom and tact. We would kindly request that if people, out of respect to the science and from the, this practitioner of the science, please consider. I said everybody did. So one just have to have the yaqeen. Because if you don't have self-respect, why would others respect you? So if you behave like a doormat, everybody's going to walk all over you. And that's the hal of the Sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? That's how, I say, the greatest benefit one can find from from true ulama is ta'zeem li amrillah, right? In his travelogue, Mufti Taqi Usmani mentions once there's an Islamic conference and all kind of research was happening, etc. But he felt that there's, the imani, the connection to the haqa'iq of iman was sort of not emphasized. So he asked to give closing words. And he said, there's hundreds of people gathered. There's more people gathered here than were at the Battle of Badr. What distinguishes us from the people of Badr? It's not knowledge. The people gathered, the average person gathered probably knows more about the religion than the average Sahabi, because not all of them were ulama, just in terms of just amounts of knowledge, right? Like amounts of outward knowledge, not the knowledge that matters. Right? But what distinguishes is two things: love and veneration, mahabba and ta'zeem. Right? And that's paraphrasing what it is. He said it, and he brought many examples of all kinds of things. So that, and the same thing in our attitude, that in reciting, etc. Just go make wudu, do a 20-second wudu. But Shaykh Adib Kallas would not say that it's okay to touch a cassette without wudu, a cassette of Quran without wudu. Right? Likewise, the books of ilm, etc. Right? But that's in terms of adab. Right? But the Quran cannot be burnt. Right? Some people say, well, you just burn it. That's ignorance. Right? Especially if a Hanafi says that, that's ignorant. There's some khilaf about things, because some madhabs do allow that, but with conditions. Right? There's proper disposal. Some people put it on a bonfire, but then the paper flies. Right? And in Jordan, they do that on the hill. So wind's blowing, starts burning. You have to, I've been part of more than one expedition of rescuing burnt pages of Quran. Because someone tried to burn, and that's, so we have answers related to that. But here there's some good points in Hashit Ibn Saud about teaching a non-Muslim the Quran, and number two, how do you dispose of a decrepit Quran? Now, the fact that someone's not reading the Quran, you keep it for the barakah. Some of the ulama said, at least open it once a year and read at least a bit of it, so it's not mahjur. But it's better to keep it than just to dispose of it. Okay. Any questions here before we continue? Go ahead.
How does this apply to destroying, say, a poster or frames or anything with Quranic verses on it?
In itself, the best thing to do is to bury it, right? Theoretically. Right? But we live in sort of canned lives, right? And we, so it's practically difficult. And you can't bury it in someone else's land, right? Like I go visit Maulana Usman Saab. I say, can I just see your backyard? And says, could you make me a cup of tea? So he goes, makes me a cup of tea, and I dig a hole and, next to his rose bushes, and you can't do that. Can't do it on public property either, right? Can't go to a park and just bury things there. So then you can shred it, right? You can shred it. And so the ulama do allow shredding, but shredding it fine, because there some very cheap shredders. They, entire words still show. So one could shred it. Now, if someone deals with a lot of documents and papers and so on, shredders aren't that expensive. Many office supplies places, etc., You can go there and get papers professionally shredded. It's actually not very expensive at all. You could collect it up and then do that. And then if it's been thoroughly shredded, then you can put it in recycling, for example. Okay.
I have a question as well, please.
Go ahead.
Do you know when you're a student of Hifz, you're doing Hifz, or you're teaching, how do you go about when you're touching the Quran on your head? Especially for the student that is doing Hifz. In the Maliki fiqh, I think they allow to read.
Yeah.
So do Hanafi adapt to that method, or?
Okay, so that's a good question. Jazakumullah ta'ala khairan. So what about for the teacher or the student with respect to recitation? In the Hanafi school, a teacher or a student can recite the Quran word by word. Right? So you say, Alhamdu lillahi rabbil alameen. Right? Right? So, Alhamdu lillahi, with pause. You see? Right? And people teach Quran like that. And that's one way. The student, the female student, could read that way too. You can practice your tajweed at a slow pace. Right? قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. Like you just, with a basic pause, that's fine. Technically, the teacher could have the Mus'haf open and turn it with, and some Muslim countries, they actually have ways that they can turn the page using. I mean, people figure out much more complicated things. How do you turn a page without touching it? Right? People, all kinds of things. Like people use tweezers, for example, right? Or whatever. But you could use a tablet and just flip pages without touching the text itself. Because on a tablet, even if the Quran app is open, it doesn't become a Mus'haf. Right? So if you have the Quran app open, for example, right? Come on. Right? You have the Quran app open, you can just you can flick on the side to turn the pages without touching the text, that's fine. Right? Or if you have a pointer with it. So if someone wants to stick to the Hanafi school, they can. They can. In Damascus, it was customary that at least a lot of the schools, etc., would just tell people to follow the Malik, says because it's difficult enough to get people learning the Quran, difficult to find Quran teachers, etc. Personally, if someone actually bothered to ask me, I would say, look, if you're a Hanafi, if someone's educated, someone's not educated, you say like, we have answers on seekers. Someone asks for advice, I'd say, if you want to stick to your school, this is the ruling. But the Maliki opinion exists, and one in of itself, it's permitted to take another school's opinion, as long as you do so soundly. Right? Someone wants to follow the madhab, so I asked Shaykh Hassan al-Hindi about this because I was very upset that a place where my wife was registered was saying like you couldn't miss the exams for your Quran class due to for being in a period. I said, that's not fair on Hanafis. So, well, Hanafis have a choice. He said they have two choices. I said, what? He said they can either stick to their madhab and fail, or they can take the Maliki opinion. So, but what if she wants to stick to her madhab? So that's her choice, she can fail. It's their choice to put the conditions that they want. You can't run the world the way you want it, right? You want your own Quran school, go open it, right? It's a free world. Um, now, if I set up a Quran school, which I probably never will, I'd allow non-Malikis to recite bit-tahajji, because you can do it fine. But anyways, but even a lot of Indo-Pak ulama take that just for the because a lot of times it's children who learn. Either you can't go telling you like teenage girls hard enough to get people to sit down. Okay, no, you only read one word at a time, right? So it gets complicated. So the people who have experience in it generally point towards the Maliki dispensation. I'm not convinced, but that's what they say. That's what they say. Okay. Then there's the issues of intercourse and menstruation. So he says, Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, وتوطأ أي الحائض بلا غسل بتصرم لأكثره. Now, one of the things that people get all riled up about, but we have to be just straight up, that people say, well, they use all these fancy Western ideas that, the way people talk about sexual matters with women, it's as if the way the jurists talk about it, they are denying the woman agency. Okay, hold on a second. Right? Firstly, that's not the case in that the female companions, in front of male companions, asked questions about intercourse, they asked about desire, they requested talaq because they were not being satisfied by their husbands. The hadith of the Usayla, for example, etc. And so many examples, right? And the Prophet ﷺ was very clear about, the sexual rights of women and their sexual agency of women, both, right? And we see that in the lives of the Khulafa al-Rashideen as well. You can find in Hashid ibn Abdin, for example, that the Prophet that's during the time of Sayyidina Umar, he was walking down the street, and there's at night, just seeing what the needs of the Muslims were, and he heard from the house of a woman that she was singing poetry of physical longing for her husband. Right? And it was actually quite shocking, not shocking, just explicitly, quite straight up. Right? That were it not for fear of God, this bed would be making a lot of noise tonight. So Sayyidina Umar did not say, "O woman, fear God, lower your voice." His concern was for her. So he went and asked his daughter, Hafsa. So at first he inquired, what's up with this woman? But out of concern for her. He said, Ya Rasulullah, her husband's been away on war, on a military expedition for a long time. So Sayyidina Umar went and consulted his daughter, who was one of the fuqaha of the Sahaba, al-Mu'mineen, Sayyidah Hafsa, radiallahu ta'ala anha. That, Hafsa. And this is now asking for expert opinion. She was learned on women's issues, etc. So he consulted her, asked for expert opinion. How long can a woman typically restrain her desires from away from her husband? He said, not more than 4 months. So he made it a law that all mujahideen and those who went on expedition could not go for longer than that period of time. Right? And that's not a legal thing, that it depends on situation. And that's why if someone were going for an extended period, then there's considerations of the wife, etc. But there's also an adab component. And this is important because the reason I mention this, because a lot of people get confused about it, and we have to convey with clarity that it is, you see in the Quran, you see in the Sunnah, that there are things that when talked about, of course they have to do, it takes two parties to engage in consensual intercourse. But it is things like that that are sensitive topics, it is not directly, in general discourse, not directly ascribed to the woman. And it's talked about with the restraint and dignity entailed by the circumstance. Very clear from how the Quran talks about it, also how the hadiths talk about it. And when directness was needed, the Prophet ﷺ addressed it as directly as needed. So, here, وَطُوطَ, the intercourse, so, literally, she may be had intercourse without ghusl, if its maximum period is complete. Right? Intercourse is permitted with the woman without ghusl if the maximal period is complete. Right? Which is if 10 days have passed. After 10 days have passed, ghusl is not required because she is legally pure. But ghusl here is recommended. And you can see this in the Maraqi. Right? If this does not sound familiar, you guys need to right? Ghusl, if the 10 days have passed, is recommended. ولو انقطع لأقله لا حتى تغتسل أو يمضي عليها أدنى وقت صلاة. If less than the maximum period is complete, so intercourse is not permitted if menstruation stops before, unless she either performs ghusl or the time of prayer passes with enough time for her to have done ghusl and prayed. But this is conditioned by one thing. What is it conditioned by? If her 'ada is complete. Right? So, intercourse and hayd, there are two cases. First, like there's a tree, and you should get used to making diagrams of things yourself. Right? So intercourse, so the period, if 10 days pass, intercourse is permitted with the 10 days being over, even if they're still bleeding. Even if they're still bleeding. 10 days passed, 240 hours have passed. So 240 hours, 1 second, intercourse is now permitted. But it is recommended to make ghusl. And that is what it is. That's the ruling. Right? Before that, if the hayd stops before the 10 days, then there are two cases. It could have stopped after her habit is complete or before her habit is complete. If the hayd stops upon completion of habit or upon completion of her habit is 7 days, 7 days have passed. Menstruation stops, then intercourse is permitted after ghusl, or in the event that she doesn't make ghusl. Someone's married to somebody who stopped praying. So what happens? She said, I'm not going to make ghusl. Says, okay, let's wait till the end of the prayer time. You should, then her not praying follows the rules of commanding the good and forbidding the wrong. So he tells her, or he's already told her like for 2 years. So Dhuhr time finishes, she didn't pray, Asr time, intercourse would be permitted. Why? Because التقصير في حق أحد ليس مسوغا للتقصير في حق غيره. Because not fulfilling the rights of one party is not a justification for not fulfilling the rights of another. Right? The husband said, I'm unemployed, so I'm not providing for the family, so therefore I shouldn't be paying attention to anyone in the family. I'm going to play video games in the backyard. No, maybe you're not able to provide, you're not able to fulfill one right, but you could do other things, right? It doesn't allow, right? So that just, same thing. You're not fulfilling the rights of Allah that you pray, does not allow you to not fulfill the rights of creation. So, but if the menstruation stops before the habit, then the stronger opinion in the madhab is that intercourse is not permitted until the habit is complete. And there's khilaf on that, but this is the right? And that's why it's important to know the rulings of hayd properly. And there's a lot of khilaf on many of the nuances, and people get surprised. And it's important also because people get all kinds of confusion. For example, what happens if someone's a very established habit, 7 days? What if there's blood on the 8th day? What does she do? The stronger opinion is that she treats it like hayd. But it's a valid opinion within the Hanafi madhab that she doesn't treat it like hayd. But how to deal with those situations? You can't just throw out answers and confuse. You're confused and you confuse others. But there's situations. Some people have a yo-yo habit. Right? You need to have the surgical ability to assess those situations. Right? وَقَلِيلٌ مَا هُمْ, but it is exceedingly rare. Okay. So that is talk about surgical precision. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So right? So if it finishes before her habit, if the hayd finishes before her habit, intercourse is not permitted, even after ghusl. Right? The same thing, you could do well to quote it from Maraqi al-Falah. You could, right? Just to be very clear about it. So intercourse, so 10 days pass, intercourse is permitted. Without ghusl is recommended. The period stops before 10 days. If the habit has passed, intercourse is permitted after ghusl, or if a time of prayer has passed with enough time for her to have performed ghusl and initiated her prayer. Right? If it's past, if the menstruation appears to have stopped before her habit, then the asl is that the habit is coming back. So the stronger opinion is that she makes ghusl, she must pray, but intercourse would not be permitted. That's a stronger opinion. But you can't treat it as if someone, anyways, it is what it is. Then he tells us about الطهر المتخلل. Right? This requires doing a little bit of justice to so let's read the expression first. Right? وَالطُّهْرُ الْمُتَخَلِّلِ. So he says, the editions differ. So here he says, in Sa'id Baghdashi's edition, it says, وَالطُّهْرُ بَيْنَ الدَّمَيْنِ فِي الْمُدَّةِ حَيْض وَنِفَاسِ. So he says, الطُّهْرُ بَيْنَ الدَّمَيْنِ. What do you have? Yeah. Number of editions have الطهر المتخلل. Right? طهر that intersperses between two bloods. within its time is menstruation. Right? Right? Or postnatal bleeding. So he puts it in brief here. If you're awake, and inshallah you were, when you're studying Nur al-Idah or Quduri, or if you did it half decently, this should be very familiar. If you've done the Risala of Imam Birgivi on Hayd, this should be very familiar. If you've done all those and this is not familiar, then I would recommend some istighfar. Right? So at-tuhr al-mutakhallil, intermittent purity between two bloods within its time is menstruation or postnatal bleeding. So when it applies at a simple level, day 1 blood, day 3 blood, no blood on day 2, all of it's considered like blood. That's very simple. Where the gap is customary, she doesn't need to start praying again. Right? And there's details about that. If you have an unusual habit, don't guess, consult. Don't guess, consult. And it's also something that we've mentioned some of the resources that it needs detail. We won't go into a lot of detail on it. The TFT, the Toronto Fiqh team, will share a diagram of this issue, inshallah, in English. So the underlying principle of this is that, as Ibn Abdin mentions, that it is not a condition that the bleeding take place in the whole time. Right? Because it's inevitable and ghalib and general that haid stops and starts. So if there's a gap, then there's one blood, another blood, all of it after the fact is considered like bleeding. Okay. So the condition is that if the beginning is haid, the end is haid, so someone had bleeding on day 1. Or bleeding, to simplify, bleeding for 3 days. Then day 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there is no bleeding. Beginning of the 10th day, there was bleeding. After the fact, everything from day 3 to day 9, as after the fact, is considered effective bleeding. If you're not sure, then you would make ghusl, because 3 days passed. You make ghusl, and you would start praying and fasting, because there's no blood. Right? If this is normal, that there'd be a gap here, then you could go with that normal, if you wished. Right? But after the fact, when the second blood happens, all of that is considered to be effectively tahar, effectively hayd, right? With its implications. That's a simple, right? This, as presented, however, is the opinion of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Right? And this is what's in the generality of the mutun. You're sort of stuck in the mutun that this is the so most of the mutun mention this opinion? So what we'll do here is we'll respect the fact. So the simple case we understand. That's what he goes into in the matan. That within the 10 days, there is bleeding, stops bleeding, all of it's considered hayd. Abu Yusuf, but then what happens? What if there's bleeding for 3 days, then it stopped. And then day 14, there was bleeding. What happens then? What? So that's where we will share a summary of the principles related to al-Tuhr al-Mutakhallil, of this intermittent bleeding, right? And you can just keep that as a appendix, right? So we'll discuss it here with the Toronto team. The core principles, and while it looks like Imam Muhammad's position, which is stated in the text here, looks simpler, but it's not, because in real life we have to consider not just immediate practicality, but we also need to account for 15 days of tuhur, right? And unusual cases. So the position of Imam Muhammad is also said to be the final opinion of Imam Abu Hanifah. And most of the commentaries took the position of Imam Muhammad, right? And one of the considerations is, Sorry. What's in the mutun is the position of Imam Muhammad. Abu Hanifa's position corresponds to that of Abu Yusuf, which is not what is mentioned here, and we'll break it down. I don't want to take too much time on this in the class, but we'll take it separately, because his opinion needs a little bit of unpacking, right? And that's why, but it also has a practice that sometimes what's easier and practical is not necessarily what looks easier and appears to be practical. The intelligent person judges things by likely outcomes, right? Like someone, is hungry and diabetic, and there's just 2 chocolate bars, and they eat both chocolate bars. It may appear that this will take care of your hunger, but no, because it'll take your blood sugar on a roller coaster ride. So it's not going to give you relief. It's going to throw you off, right? So here the basic issue is what we mentioned. So here you have to say this is according to the position of Imam Muhammad. The relied upon position is that of Abu Yusuf. Put an asterisk. We look at. And so Abu Yusuf's opinion is easier. It's more difficult to understand, but it's easier to apply given the nature of women's periods and given the implications of applying Imam Muhammad's opinion and the implications of applying Abu Yusuf's opinion, right? But both exist, and sometimes the Imam Muhammad opinion would solve things, but generally, if you stick to Abu Yusuf's opinion, it would clarify matters.
In one of his he says, مطلقاً عندهما, and then he says Imam Muhammad's position is something else. وعند محمد الطهر إذا تخلل بين الدمين في الحيض إن كان أقل من
Okay, so don't read the whole text. I have the text in front of me too. What's the question?
So isn't it that Imam Abu Yusuf and Imam Abu Hanifah had one position and Imam Muhammad?
Yeah, so what's mentioned in the text is the position of Imam Muhammad.
He says
So what's the question?
So wouldn't that mean that
No, I don't. Wouldn't that, like we've banned the word that. So right? So let's be let's be precise in asking question. The sound reading of the text here is, what's mentioned in the text is the opinion of Imam Muhammad. There's another way of reading the text, but this is the majority of the commentators understand it in this way. What's mentioned in the text is that this is the position of Imam Muhammad, and that's what's mentioned in Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq and most of the commentaries. Even Abu Saud confirms that. Number two, there's a position of Abu Yusuf. There's disagreement what is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. Most of them said that Abu Hanifa's position corresponds to that of Abu Yusuf. That is a dhanni ascription, because there's khilaf about that what was Abu Hanifa's position, and also do we have an explicit narration from Imam Abu Hanifa about this, or is it understood by indications of other things? That's a claim, but it's a claim by inference, it would seem, right? Allahu a'lam. So, but we can't ask. It says mutlaqan. So this, what are you asking about, right? Like we're not here to unpack Mullah Miskin, but there's two things: position of Imam Muhammad, which is that tuhur within its time, intermittent purity within its time. It says it's considered like ongoing bleeding. In the position of Abu Yusuf, to the contrary, it has a few principles to understand, and we'll take that separately. If you want to simplify the issue, this is explained in Nur al-Idah with the Maraqi in a basic manner. Number two, it's explained in the treatise on menstruation by Imam al-Birgivi, which is available in English, and it's available in Arabic, and you can see examples of this. Okay. Then he says, وَأَقَلُّ الطُّهُرِ 15 يوما. The minimum purity is 15 days, right? وَلَا حَدَّ لِأَكْثَرِهِ, right? And there's no limit to its maximum. We're not like, she's not experiencing menstruation, so no, there must be blood. No, there isn't. Faraz. Right? So there's no maximal period of tuhur, generally. So the minimum tuhur, i.e. the minimum tuhur that separates between two haids. Right? أقل الطهر أي الفاصل بين الحيضتين. Right? The minimum tuhur that separates between two haids, or that separates between nifas and hayd, right, is 15 days. There's one exception. إلا عند نصب العادة, unless one needs to establish a habit, a عادة. في زمن الاستمرار, if the bleeding is continual. So what happens if the bleeding is continual? The bleeding is continual, then the default is that we take her back to her habit. Right? So this here is conditioned. This, unless there's a need to establish a habit, right? So he leaves it like this, right? Unconditional. Right? Here, so unless we need to establish a habit if the bleeding is continual. This is one of the few places where Maraq al-Falah, Nur al-Idah and Maraq al-Falah mention that which is contrary to the madhab. What is the relied upon position in the madhab? That, right? Firstly, if the bleeding becomes continual, So a woman has bleeding or has bleeding every single day. If she has discolored discharge every day, then go to a scholar and they should be able to address that comfortably. If they can't, then which is the default, right? It's a big fitna, and if they can't, you can't blame them. You got to blame ourselves that we don't give scholars the time to think or blink or to take care of these things, right? Scholars shouldn't be out there doing political protests and doing these things that can't answer people's basic religious questions, right? So the woman can be mu'tada or mubtada'a. The woman can be a woman, she can have a habit. If she has a habit, if the bleeding continues, she's returned, فَتُرَدُّ إِلَى عَادَتِهَا. She's returned to her habit. If she does not have a habit at all, and this is called the mubtada'a, someone who's never had a previous habit. So someone at the age of 12, she became baligh by bleeding starting and it's not stopping. Then we establish a habit for her. And what's the habit that we establish for her? According to? According to what? How do you know? So what is it?
According to the hadith, 10 days of hayat and then 19 or 20 depending on the month.
Yeah. So 10 days, the relied upon position is that if the bleeding continues and the woman does not have a habit, then her habit is defined as being 10 days hayd and the rest of the month to be tuhur, right? Which would be 20 days or 19. And there's some details. But if you have Maraq al-Falah, you should note here that this is one of the few places where the opinion taken by Imam Shurun Bulali is not, the ulama generally did not deem it to be a sound opinion in the Hanafi madhab. Sometimes Shurun Bulali chooses things that may be contrary to what is more correct or what most of the scholars deem to be the fatwa position, but generally it would be a sound opinion within madhab. This is one of the few places where that's not the case. And there's a few others, but they're rare. Okay. So the bleeding continual, there are two scenarios. If she has a habit, she's returned to it. If she has no previous habit, that's called the mubtada'a. Then a habit is set for her, 10 days bleeding, rest of the month, tuhur. Which is, some texts just mention 20 days, but it's technically, but that's a theoretical thing, really. That if her bleeding stopped right at the beginning of the month, then if the hayd started corresponding to the beginning of the month, then it could potentially be 19. Anyways, you can nerd it out if you want. What you can remember is 10 days hayd, 20 days tuhur, if she doesn't have a previous habit. Then the last thing we're going to look at today, irregular discharge. Right? Irregular discharge, istihada. Right? Istihada, he tells us, istihada, وَدَمُ الْإِسْتِحَاضَةِ كَرُعَافٍ دَائِمٍ. Irregular discharge is like a continual nosebleed. This only in its rulings, they don't resemble each other. We're not talking about biology. They come from slightly different places. But it's just in terms of ruling. Because the fuqaha don't have to explain why this blood is happening, where it's coming from. It's coming out. the fuqaha said, it came out, it is not hayd. Therefore, it is istihada. So any discolored discharge that comes out that is not hayd or nifas, it's istihada. That's it. Okay? Some of the fuqaha distinguish between different names for them, but generally, right? So this discharge is a state of tuhur. All it does is that if the discharge comes out, it breaks wudu. So the discolored discharge is a state of tuhur. It requires wudu, but the rulings related to a state of non-menstruation apply. During istihada, can a woman recite Quran? Yes. Is intercourse allowed even if the blood is gushing like Niagara Falls? It's not a state of hayd. The only consideration would be if there was any physical hurt or harm, then it would be recommended to avoid. But otherwise, in terms of permissibility, it's permissible. It's like a nosebleed, right? In that sense, right? لا يمنع صلاة. It does not prevent prayer or fasting. لا يمنع صلاة وصوما ووطئا. Does not prevent prayer, fasting, nor intercourse. Right? Even voluntary prayers. It's not a state of, the tahara here is not out of necessity. So it's not like a person with a chronic excuse. It's not a state of necessity. It's a state of tuhur. It just invalidates wudu and is najis. But, and everything else would be permitted with its consideration. Recitation of Quran is permitted. Touching the Quran is permitted after making wudu, because istihada breaks wudu. Entering the masjid is permitted. But it's recommended to make wudu before entering. Just like, it's improper to enter the Quran without wudu. Ru'af, of course, is blood from the nose, like a nosebleed. And you can see they discuss how it's pronounced. And as you pick up vocabulary, pick up the forms. What bab is it from? Is it ra'afa or ra'ufa? Is it nasar? It's like in bab nasara yansuru, or it's from some other bab. It's not sufficient in Arabic just to look up the meaning of a word. Otherwise, you're just like a tourist. Right? You don't know what's going on. Okay? And that's why one of the dictionaries that one should refer to consistently is Mukhtar al-Sihah. Frequently doesn't give you the meaning, but tells you what bab something is from. So we're not going to explain that, because that's from the duties of a talib ilm. Then he says, وَلَوْ زَادَ الدَّمُ عَلَى أَكْثَرِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ فَمَا زَادَ عَلَى عَادَتِهَا استحاضة. If bleeding goes beyond the maximum menstrual period or the maximum period of postnatal bleeding, then anything that goes beyond her past habit is considered irregular discharge after the fact. Right? So if the bleeding goes beyond the maximum number of days of the hayd, meaning 10, or the maximum number of days of nifas, meaning 40, this is in the case where she has a previous habit, right? Whether it's short habit or long habit, then anything that goes beyond her habit after the fact is deemed to be istihada. So her habit is 7 days. Day 8, initially it is assumed hayd. Day 9 is assumed hayd. Day 10 is assumed hayd. But once it enters day 11, then everything beyond her habit, beyond 7 days, so day 8, 9, 10, are deemed after the fact to have been istihada. Therefore, while she has the complete reward of those prayers and fasts, the prayers after the fact were not required of her. Qada would not be valid. Number 3, if she had missed prayers during that time, she was repentant. She must repent insofar as at that time she did not do the right thing, but she would not have to make it up. The fasts done on those days, in our madhab, the stronger opinion is that those fasts post facto were not valid. She'd have to pray them again. But don't go around giving people fatwa that someone asks, I keep getting this situation, what do I do? Anything unusual, don't just go with the default, because many of these things, there is difference within our madhab and difference with other madhahib, right? So sometimes if one learns one's fiqh properly, you may be able to teach it, but any unusual question comes, say, I don't know. They say, yeah, I heard there's an opinion, that's okay. That is irresponsible and the major sin. Because it's not just misconveying the Hanafi madhab, it is to talk about the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of your mere opinion. Right? Sayyidina Abu Bakr said, when he was asked about something seemingly simple about the Quran, about, can you explain 2 of the rewards in paradise? He said, what earth can sustain me and what sky can shelter me if I speak about the book of Allah out of my mere opinion? And the hukm of Allah is ashad than the khabar of Allah. Right? The hukm is even more dangerous. So say, don't say I don't know and dabbir halak. No, say, I don't know. Let me find out for you. And ask. Allah. Okay. And if she doesn't have a habit, وَلَوْ مُبْتَدَأَةً, if she does not have a habit, فَحَيْضُهَا عَشَرَةٌ وَنِفَاسُهَا أَرْبَعُونَ. If she does not have a previous habit, the mubtada'a, then her hayd is considered 10 days. Right? And her nifas is considered 40 days. Right? And the rest is considered istihada. And then there is chronic excuses. So he mentions the chronic excuses briefly. These are dealt with in a spectacular, like in a very clear manner, and very beneficial manner in Nur al-Idah. The summary of it is that someone has a chronic excuse, it's a haraj. It's a hardship. Hardship is lifted. Now, if you can prevent being in a hardship, you do so, right? Like, so someone says, every time, every time I go to my uncle's house for Maghrib, he kicks me when I'm in prostration. Can I skip Maghrib? Say, no, don't go to your uncle's house at Maghrib, right? Because if putting yourself in if you can prevent a situation that's an undue hardship, yeah, you have a right not to be kicked while you're in prostration. But there's no obligation to go to your uncle's house right at Maghrib time. Pray in the parking lot and then go to your uncle's house, right? And that's just common sense. So, when there's a chronic excuse, a chronic excuse is an ongoing invalidation of wudu. This can happen with istihada, and it can happen with other than istihada. That if there's a way to avoid the excuse without undue hardship, you must. Right? So this is an important principle before we read the ahkam. يَجِبُ رَدُّ الْعُذْرِ بقدر الإمكان. It is obligatory, it is necessary to avoid the chronic excuse if to the extent possible. To the extent possible. So if all you need to avoid the excuse is to, for example, if you do a deep ruku, if you can hold it in, like say someone has gas trouble, but you can hold it in, then you have to hold it in. If it happens by making a deep ruku, do a slight ruku. Right? So the reasonable things you can do, you can do. The ulama mentioned a number of theoretical things that you could do, but those you should consult and you should be careful before you convey. They mentioned you could take tissue, you could take some cotton and insert it into the tip of the male organ, for example. Right? Now, firstly, this is on the assumption that things aren't bleached using chemicals, etc. And number two, on the assumption that you know what you're doing. Right? And the assumption, all things are stated by the fuqaha on the assumption of non-harm. Right? Non-harm. Because we know that there's no harm, there's no hardship in our religion, there's no harm. Something that's going to cause hardship or harm could not be an expectation of the Sharia. Right? So you have to be careful because all kinds of solutions are mentioned. They're mentioned theoretically on the assumption that okay, you could implement this without harm. Chronic excuses most times are unbelievable because I'd say 8 out of 10 cases it's waswasa, it's misgivings, not chronic excuses. Someone says, someone says, I have a chronic excuse because I always pass wind when I want to pray. Hold it in. Simple, right? Hold it in, right? Sometimes it's triggered by something, don't do it, right? Whenever I wash dishes, I get bleeding hands. Okay, wear gloves, right? I mean, like gloves do exist, right? Apply cream before you make wudu, like you have but assuming that it's not waswasa, then there are 3 conditions, right? There's shart al-thubut, shart al-baqa, and shart al-inqita'. Right? And this is discussed very nicely in Nur al-Idah in the Maraqi. One should know this like this. The condition of establishing a chronic excuse is that the entire prayer time not be free of enough time to make wudu and pray without the excuse arising. So if an entire prayer time, there's not enough time to make wudu and pray without that excuse manifesting, then that establishes the excuse. That's shartul thubut. Shartul baqa, the condition for it continuing, that each prayer time has the excuse at least once. Shartul inqita', the condition of the excuse ending, that an entire prayer time passes without the chronic excuse manifesting even once. But this chronic excuse is khilaf al-asl. So if someone has genuinely a chronic condition that they lose their wudu if they pray standing and with prostration, but they can do so sitting down, then they must pray sitting down. They do it with head movements, they do it with head movements. But practically, in most cases, just hold it in. Right? And in most cases, that works. Right? Okay. So, he says, وَتَتَوَضَّأُ الْمُسْتَحَاضَةُ, the woman experiencing postnatal bleeding. Sorry. It should say experiencing istihada. The woman experiencing istihada, right? We have to fix the slides we put up because there's a couple of corrections today. Right? The woman experiencing istihada, right? the woman experiencing istihada, irregular discharge, and likewise someone who has consistent وَمَنْ بِهِ سَلَسْ bowl, and someone who has consistent urinary dripping. أو استطلاق بطن, or who has a constant so istitlaq batn literally means constant excrement, right? They can't hold in excrement. أو انفلات ريح, right? In istitlaq batn is that basically they have diarrhea, right? They can't hold in their excrement. نسأل الله العافية. أو انفلات ريح, or constant gas, right? Meaning it comes out without being able to hold it in, right? أو رعاف دائم, or continual nosebleed. أو جرح لا يرقى, or a wound that will not stop bleeding. So what do? All these, right? They make wudu. تتوضأ لوقت كل فرض. They make wudu for each fard prayer. ويصلون به فرضا ونفلا. And after that they can pray as much fard and nafil as they want, right? ويبطل وضوءهم بخروجه فقط. And their wudu is only invalidated by the exiting of the time, right? And he points to the condition هذا, and هذا meaning حكم المعذور, the ruling of the person with the chronic excuse, is إن لم يمضي عليهم وقت فرض إلا وذلك الحدث يوجد فيه. That this remains if no period of time. Is this in the? Yes. This remains if no complete prayer time passes without the excuse, with the absence of the excuse, right? So these are the three conditions, right? Shart thubut, shart baqa, or shart dawam, and shart inqita, right? And if a whole period of time passes without the excuse, the time ends. There's three principles, right? That if you can hold in the urge to pass wind, that's the only way then you must hold it in, right? Like if one hold it in without undue hardship, like if it starts causing you pain, stomach ache, whatever, right? And number two, so so one must take all means to avoid the excuse or to diminish the excuse, because it's najasa, right? Even if it means praying with head movements. But anytime your actions are going to be outside the usual, consult about them, because that could be delusion. Could be delusion. Have mercy on yourself, right? But you don't have to do anything that entails hardship. Now, if this is relevant to people who are wounded, right? That if the bleeding gets onto your garments, right? Then if washing the garments, you could be excused from washing the garments if, were you to wash them, make wudu, and pray, they would have more than the excused amount of filth the second time. Because then there's no benefit in washing the filth, right? So someone's wound has open wounds, for example. So if it's getting on their clothing, right? They cut their thigh, right? So if they could change their garment, make wudu and pray, and they would now have less than the excuse amount of filth, then, and they're able to do so on their own, they would need to do so. But if they're, if either they couldn't change by themselves, right? Or were they to change their bandage or their clothing, there would again be more than the excuse amount of filth, then that would be excuse. So there's no point in it. And that is very beneficial for example, someone was in an accident, there's all kinds of blood that's seeping. Could they on their own go by themselves, without medical assistance, change their clothing or their bandaging by themselves and make wudu and pray, and so they're in a state of chronic excuse with less than the excuse amount of bleeding? So basically, if blood gets on your clothes, due to a chronic excuse, it's likely that it'll be excused, right? This also applies in work situations, right? Separate, which is if filth gets on you, right? That someone, let's say, they got some urine on their trouser, and it's winter, let's say in Canada. So they went to a public restroom, some urine got on them. Now, if let's say it's minus 20 outside, can you wash your trousers and go out in the cold? Let's say you're going to be waiting for the bus, that'd be hardship. Can you show up at work with a big stain on your thighs from washing your clothing? No. Right? So that would be excused, right? Now if you can minimize it, that's better. We'll see some of that in najasa. And then there is postnatal bleeding, right? النفاس دم يعقب الولد, right? Postnatal bleeding is blood after childbirth, or after most of the child comes out. عاقب الولد أو أكثره. يعقب الولد أو أكثره. That comes after the child or after most of it. Now, if she doesn't see any blood, okay, pay attention here. If she doesn't see any blood, then what is the relied upon opinion? Who's she?
She's in the state of purity.
Who is she?
The woman who gave birth.
Okay, so let's be clear, okay? Right? If the woman who gave birth doesn't see any blood, let's just say, this practically doesn't happen, right? But let's say she gave birth and there's no blood. What is the madhab?
She's in the state of purity.
Is that the madhab?
Because the minimum time of bleeding is 0 and the maximum is 40. So even if it's like a drop, and then she doesn't have any, she's in the state of purity.
According to?
The Hanafi fiqh.
No. So there's no according to the Hanafi fiqh. Like where does it say this, right? So no, that's not correct. There is no minimum for postnatal bleeding. But if a woman gives birth and she does not see any blood, the position of Imam Abu Hanifah, and this is the madhab, is that she must do ghusl. Okay? And all kinds of people are clueless about that. If a woman gives birth, وَإِن لَمْ تَرَ دَمًا, إِن وَلَدَتْ وَلَمْ تَرَ دَمًا, if she gives birth and she does not see blood, and blood, of course, when does the blood count for postnatal bleeding? Doesn't see any blood after the child comes out. So the child comes out and there's no blood. Let's just say, ghusl is required according to Abu Hanifa. Because this is highly unlikely. وَالنَّادِرُ كَالْعَدَمِ. And the rare is considered as if it's not the case. And it could be that the blood disappeared. Maybe the kid's armpit came out last and there's blood under the armpit. Like whatever. Like we don't have to prove why didn't the blood count. This is what is the madhab? The madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa is what is soundly transmitted from Imam Abu Hanifa and what the ulama of the madhab have deemed. There is ikhtilaf with the Sahibain on this issue. Here, Imam al-Shurunbulali inclined towards the other position. That's a choice, and others have chosen that too, but it is not the predominant position in the Hanafi madhab. And this is also, amongst its merits, is that it is the more precautious opinion. Right? Right? So, al-Tahtawi, for example, says, وَهُوَ الْمَذْهَبِ. Right? This is the madhab. Right? And others use such unequivocal terms. Because they say لأن الغالب كالمتحقق, because the general case is considered as if actual. والنادر في حكم العدم, and the rare case is considered as if non-existent. And this is of the places of caution, right? Because it has to do with the validity of prayer, etc. And also it's closer to an outward reading of the texts as well. Right? And وَدَمُ الْحَامِلِ استحاضة. Any bleeding of a pregnant woman is considered irregular discharge. Now there's many rulings related to miscarriage. It's outside our scope to look at all the rulings, but and you can find the rulings in some detail if you look in the Maraqi with Tahtawi, also if you look at, and there's many rulings, and miscarriages happen, right? And now people are more familiar with miscarriages through, short, brief miscarriages, and so on. And they're real issues. So one needs to know both the fiqh of them, and also needs to know about the religious dimensions of them, because for a lot of people find it difficult, right? Right? And also how, people. So miscarriage, the siqt, right? The siqt, the miscarried fetus, right? Which is, when the fetus comes out of the woman dead. إِن ظَهَرَ بَعْدُ خَلْقِهِ وَلَدٍ. The miscarried fetus, if anything of their form is apparent, is considered a child. And anything of their creation, they say, كَظُفْرٍ وَشَعْرٍ. Even if it be a nail or hair, it's considered a child. So the woman would be considered nufasa, should be in a state of postnatal bleeding. The iddah is finished by that, and the rest of the implications of being a child would apply. They should be buried, and then there's rulings related to burial, related to being named, related to being prayed over, and those you can see in the Maraqi, and you can see them in. But even in cases where, let's say someone had an early miscarriage, you also have to deal with things with empathy. Someone says, can I bury them? So one thing is, when there isn't a requirement for burying, but they said, okay, here is a lump of flesh, and they had great hopes in the child. Said, no, they're not buried. No, the fact that it's not required to bury, for example, or it's not specifically sunnah to name, right? Like that one is just consult. Don't go around deeming people because, and for some people, say, okay, just give them a name, right? If you can name, if you value your pen, you can give it a name. The Prophet named his belongings. Someone miscarried, they wanted called miscarriage number 3, Bulbul. Let them call her Bulbul. Like, what's it with you? Right? So don't be insensitive. Like, as cold as you have to be to think clearly about fiqh, right? At the same time have a little bit of heart, right? How you treat that, ask those who know, right? Is a child. لا ولا حد لأكثره. There's no maximal period. Sorry, what is it? عفوا لحد لأقله. My misreading. There's no minimal limit for nifas. And people confuse two things. Right? It could end right away. But even if there's 0 hours of nifas, highly unlikely, ghusl is still required, right? Right? Those are two separate issues. وأكثره 40 يوما. Its maximum is 40 days. والزائد استحاضة. And anything beyond this is irregular discharge. If anything beyond 40 is irregular discharge, if she didn't have a habit. If she did have a habit, then anything beyond her habit, if the bleeding goes beyond 40 days, would be considered irregular discharge. ونفاس التوأمين من الأول. The postnatal bleeding from twins is considered from the first of the twins. And that has some implications. So sorry, our class has been unduly long. That's the section on menstruation. We will share a summary of the rulings of the طهر المتخلل by Saturday, inshallah. So you'll have them there, and we'll also share بإذن الله تعالى the core rules related to the core principles related to. Did we ask Shaykh Ashraf? And we'll share the principles related to Hayd al-Nifas. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Did anyone ask Sufyan? Did anyone ask me? Was I asked? Oh, that's not it. I wasn't asked.